Sacred Space on West Limerick 102.
So welcome back again to the second part of Sacred Space on West Limerick 102. Again, my name is John Keeley, joined in studio here by Bishop Donal. We've got Anne Shanes on the other end of the telephone. And we've got the lady who's working for the Lord so much these days, we can't catch up with her, but it's lovely to have you inside the studio for this little while. Good morning to you, Lorraine. How are you?
Good morning, John. Good morning, listeners. I'm very well, thank you.
You've got your breath back.
I do indeed.
Fair dues to you. Well, between yourself and Shane and Bishop Donal this morning, I think you're going to talk to us about conscience.
Yes, we are indeed. And
Okay.
we're going to start with a very simple question for Bishop Donal. What is conscience?
I thought you said a simple question. It's not a simple question at all.
No, it isn't, of course.
And part of the problem is I think that people don't really understand what conscience is.
Mm-hmm.
Conscience is really what's deepest in me.
Mm-hmm.
In the Second Vatican Council said that when we really go into the depths of ourselves, we meet God.
Mm-hmm.
And we decide our own destiny.
Wow.
So that in a sense, every time we exercise our conscience, we're responding to God. And, people often talk as if it was just, this is my opinion and that's what I'll do. It requires reflection.
Mm-hmm.
It requires trying to tease out, if you like, what's involved in any particular decision, and to tease it out in a way which actually responds to the gift that God offers us.
Sure. And in one sense then we're kind of doing that all the time with all our moral actions.
Exactly.
Whether we're doing it consciously or unconsciously, we're listening to our conscience.
Yes, exactly. And, it's a kind of a judgment that we make having opened our minds and our hearts to the reality, to the other people who are affected, to the issues that are facing us and so on.
Sure, because for an act to be morally good, the action itself has to be good and the intention has to be good.
Yes,
and the
exactly.
circumstances have to be good.
Absolutely.
So you're trying to consider
Absolutely.
all these three things.
Yes, and if any bit of that is wrong, then the action is actually far from perfect. It might be very far from perfect if the basic choice you're making is a wrong one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think an important thing actually that you mentioned there is kind of the difference, I suppose, between opinion and kind of having an informed conscience and kind of being open to that inner voice, listening to, making space for God. And sometimes I suppose we can be in a situation where you might express a view that can be seen as being judgmental because it's seen as being an opinion more than anything else, and that can be challenging, I suppose, in many respects.
Yeah, I think the thing about judgmental is one that we should reflect on a bit, because the one thing when any discussions take place about social issues and everything, one thing people say is you mustn't be judgmental. And they often quote Pope Francis. Pope Francis is supposed to have said, "Who am I to judge?" Actually, that's not quite what he said. He said, if a person is gay and is doing their best and is seeking God and so on, who am I to judge that person? And I think it's a very important distinction between judging an action and judging a person. Because judging a person is something we can't do.
Well, no, only God can judge a person.
Exactly. Exactly. But we can judge an action. In other words, we can say, let's say, I don't care how sincere you are, that thing that you've taken belongs to me, and I want it back. You've wronged me by taking it. So, of course we can be judgmental about actions, but you must never be judgmental about a person. Perfect example in the Gospel, by the way, of the person who was judgmental about a person was the Pharisee.
Yes.
He said, "Thanks be to God, I'm not like that fella at the back of the room." And we often do that.
There's a bit of that in all of us, isn't there?
Yes, we often make our judgment by comparison with somebody else, and we say, maybe I'm not perfect, but I'm a heck of a lot better than that fella over there. And that's fatal. I mean, that's a complete distortion of what conscience is about.
We've spoken about actions, I suppose, and judging actions. And I suppose one question I suppose people might ask would be, when you're looking at, you could be in a situation which is difficult. And I suppose the question is, can someone be compelled to do something that is against their conscience, if you like? If you've discerned something, if you've prayed about something, and can you still be called upon to act against what you believe in your innermost depth?
I think it's almost impossible to justify that. But you could get somebody, and that's another thing we might come back to, but you could get somebody who has convinced himself, let's say, that he's entitled to do something or other, which in fact is a violation of somebody else's rights. So it might be that the person has to be kind of forced to give up something, let's say, that he wants to keep because it doesn't belong to him. So I think you have to make that kind of distinction. The other thing I was going to say about conscience is that conscience can be manipulated, especially by the person, him or herself. Sometimes when we say we're trying to make up our conscience, what we're actually doing is looking for reasons to do the thing that we really want to do. So we can be fooling ourselves.
I read somewhere that the first school of conscience or checking what conscience is self-criticism, that we kind of look at what we want to do first and then go, where does my conscience lie with this?
Exactly.
And then we kind of look to other means, which brings us to the point about informing our conscience. Can a conscience be informed, or how do we go about informing a conscience?
Well, I think we do the best we can. You're always a bit sceptical about somebody who's so sure that he's right that he doesn't have to listen anymore. Forming conscience is an ongoing thing. But we form our conscience maybe first of all by saying, am I judging this in a way that suits me or the group to which I belong? Am I coming to the conclusion I really want to come to? Or am I honestly looking at this? Am I looking at the kind of advice I should be getting? Am I examining the thing from other people's points of view as well as mine, and so on? Those are the kind of questions I think we have to ask ourselves. Is this an honest judgment?
Because I think it was Blessed Cardinal Newman that said to listen to one's conscience is to search for the truth.
Yes.
And to search for the truth really is to search for God ultimately.
Exactly. I think that's absolutely true. And I think it is a search. And if we're not honestly searching, then we're probably fooling ourselves.
And then what about the freedom of conscience? It's kind of something that's bandied around quite a lot.
Yes.
But what does that mean? What does freedom of conscience mean?
Well, it means, first of all, I think that people should not, except in very circumstances, as I was saying earlier on, should not be forced to do something they believe is wrong. And I think there's a lot of areas that comes up in, where people are pressurised by their boss or something, or indeed where politicians are pressurised by the party whip to do something that they don't believe is right. In the case of politicians, that's a very dangerous thing, because does it actually lead people to believe that the politicians don't necessarily behave with integrity? And I think that's part of the problem with people in politics nowadays, that they see a kind of a system according to which people have to vote a particular way.
And you have to be very brave then to stand up and to kind of act according to one's conscience.
Exactly. So I think we should be very careful of situations, certainly of situations of people being forced to do what they don't believe in. But even people being forced to do things that they're just not happy about,
one of the things I suppose that just struck me there was we were talking about creating a space for each individual to discern how to judge an action that themselves. And I suppose the question would be, where can they look, if you like, to see or to seek guidance on kind of informing that conscience? Where because sometimes I suppose people would say it's very much, well, it's me and God, that kind of a way. Or it goes back to that whole point we were saying, that is it my informed conscience or is it my informed opinion, and the difference between the two.
Yeah, I think that actually making a decision, we need to look at. One of the things perhaps nowadays is that there's a kind of a tendency not to look back at our history, at what formed us, at what our traditions are. Traditions are really the wisdom of all the people that went before us and faced problems like the ones we faced, maybe different in some ways, but sometimes in some ways the same. And for somebody to say, I don't need to listen to any of that, it's it's quite arrogant, really. And there is a sense of that now in modern society, I think, of saying, well, the past is the past and we're moving into a wonderful new future and we don't need to bother with those things at all. But I think that's very foolish. So I think the first thing is that we listen to our own traditions, our own backgrounds, what we've learned from parents and grandparents and those who went before them and so on. So that's maybe where you start. And then, of course, one of the traditions we belong to is the Christian tradition, the church. So that's a place that we listen to. We also listen to people who are experts in a particular field. When there's a complicated decision to be made in economics and so on, I mean, the immediate decision that I might make might be disastrous because I don't really understand how finance works, and on a kind of an international level, let's say. Does anybody?
Well, that is a fair point. Does anyone understand? It's interesting, I suppose when we talk about informing ourselves and looking to the tradition, there is, I suppose, a tendency maybe to have an assumption that humanity is always progressing to the better. That, when we look back, everything in the past is always wrong. And it's always something, there's nothing there of value to be learnt. But I suppose, the other side of that is that saying that you'd come across as a person that is ignorant of the history is bound to repeat the mistakes of the past.
Precisely.
And it's just that we should be conscious of that in many respects, that, particularly when we look around and the decisions that we make in the world today, people have a tendency to ignore the church's teaching because it's cool to ignore the church at the moment. But at that same time, the church has a 2,000-year-old tradition, and she has considered human nature for 2,000 years, if you like, and has a lot to offer in some respects. I found it interesting during the week. I came across an interesting speech that was made in the US, and it was a commencement address to the Liberty University, and it came from the most unexpected source. The person that gave it was actually Jeb Bush, and he's the son of George Bush. Now, not exactly someone you would have been promoting in terms of, Christian view. But one of the things he was saying is, he was quoting Chesterton, and he was saying, "These are the days," as Chesterton remarked, "in which Christians are expected to praise every faith but their own." And it's almost like a case of, when we're talking about conscience and we're talking about discerning our conscience, that in some ways we're encouraged to look to every other, if you like, view or ideology or outlook on life and expect to accept it as gospel, and it's to kind of, in some respects, to ignore anything of value that the church might have to offer.
Yeah. You see, I think one of the things the church has to offer is that it begins by asking a question that isn't asked at all in modern politics or economics. What is a human being? What is human life for? And I think if you don't ask those questions, then you're paddling around on the surface. You're not getting into the depth of anything. So that's really important. I was thinking when you were talking about the assumption that everything had improved, a phrase that Cardinal Connolly often used to use. He said, "Not all improvements are for the better."
Sure.
I love that quote. But conscience is very much tied up with dignity, about human dignity, isn't it?
Exactly.
And I came across a quote from St. John the 23rd, and he said, "To do violence to people's conscience means to harm them seriously, to deal an extremely painful blow to their dignity. In a certain sense, it is worse than killing them." Like, it's powerful to make people act against their conscience.
I think that's right, and I think that there is a sort of a thing. I mean, if you want to go back into history, there is a kind of, people would say that the whole Enlightenment and the French Revolution and all the rest of it began talking about liberté, and all that. Liberty was the thing. But then they discovered that lots of people didn't really understand what they needed to do in order to be free, so they made them. And didn't see the contradiction. And there is a sense of that a kind of an elite that thinks it knows what everybody should be doing.
Sure.
Which is the opposite of democracy.
It's interesting, when we talk about, infringing on a person's conscience and the dignity of it, how that impacts on human dignity. I suppose sometimes, it's in the society that we're in, where you have listened to your conscience and your gut and your instinct and your very being is telling you, well, actually, I don't agree with what someone is saying or what seems to be the general consensus. And sometimes it requires maybe a little courage, to be able to hold to that and not to give in. That's not the word I would use, but maybe to be cowed into going with the more general feeling of the moment, if you like.
I think that's a real danger, because democracy is really about people freely exchanging ideas and so on. And there is a real danger that becomes, at the very least, unpopular and maybe unprofitable. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. I think there is one distinction that needs to be made here, though. There's a distinction between forcing somebody to do something that he or she believes to be wrong. That's one fairly basic right. The other is less clear-cut, and that's allowing somebody to do something that he or she feels they should be allowed to do. Now, it's much easier in that case to see where that could be actually conflicting with other people's interests. And that it might be justified in saying, well, you might think that you should be allowed to do this, but, society doesn't think you should.
Well, of course, the thing with that, of course, is that actually, if you like, can also work both ways. While you might feel that you're in a position where you don't want to do something, then it also works the other side of it as well. You could find yourself, you're in the majority, if you like, and there's a person that is in kind of the minority view. So it's a balancing act sometimes between how people, in society, how we interpret that.
Yeah, I think it comes back to some kind of openness to really hearing where another person is coming from.
Absolutely.
And I think we probably don't have that kind of sensitivity to the degree that we have. Because unless you do that, then you're not going to be able to make a reasonable judgment about the kind of case you're talking about. If you do understand where the person is coming from, A, you may be able to show them why they're mistaken. Or B, you might react to them quite differently than you would if you hadn't understood what they were about.
But it's that whole space for dialogue and the type of dialogue sometimes that we don't seem to be able to have sometimes. As I work with many people from different nationalities, and one person has observed to me how Ireland seems to be a place of extremes in terms of going from one to the other in terms of social views, and she just found it very interesting. And I think that's kind of part of it as well. We're if you put it down to our Celtic temperament, that we embrace a view kind of wholeheartedly, one way or the other. And sometimes it's kind of hard to see a balance, a via media in how we view things.
But maybe that again goes back to something about what are our answers to the deep questions? Have we got answers to them? I think I love the thing that Frank Sheed, the Australian author, said one time about education. He said, if you say education is about preparing people for life. Now, he said, if you write to your Department of Education and say, please tell me, you're preparing people for life, please tell me, what is a person? And the Department of Education say, well, this is a liberal democracy and there are hundreds of different views about that. We can't say that. Oh, he says, yeah, and what is human life for? And they say, well, same answer. And he says, you think you can educate people and you don't know, you prepare people for life and you don't know what a person is or what life is for. And he said, and the interesting thing he said was, that's extremely odd, but the really frightening thing is that we don't see how odd it is.
And it's true because we don't teach people how to think anymore. We don't teach philosophy.
That's right.
We don't teach kind of the deeper questions. We tend to teach people how to learn stuff off or how to do formulae, but not how to think.
Yeah, you see, and that is the thing that you maybe Celts tend to emote more than to think. Now, emotion is very important. I mean, your emotion, your revulsion to something might well say to you, I think you better think again about this. But on the other hand, I mean, you better think about it.
But there's also, I suppose, a danger as well that, when sometimes people, when you're trying to have that dialogue about what is the meaning of life or why are we here, what is it to be human, and sometimes that requires that we have to make, if you like, moral judgments. But to do that, people turn around and say, "Oh, you're being judgmental. You're being what's the word I'm trying to say? You're being kind of dictatorial in many respects. To be, and it just seems like that it's kind of a free-for-all at the moment for people. That there doesn't seem to be a space or an openness or a willingness to be able to say, well, maybe that is actually something as a society we shouldn't approve of.
Yeah, you see, I think there are a number of things. One thing that was striking me when you were talking is that the thing about Pope Francis is that he recognises the dignity of every human being, whatever they're doing, whatever their history, whatever the first thing is the dignity of each human being. And we have to learn to disagree in a way that recognises that. Because, tolerance can't mean that I have to agree with everybody else. I mean, if I agree with everybody else, I'm just incoherent. It doesn't mean I must agree. It means I must respect their search for the truth. And I must treat it with reverence. But that doesn't mean I have to agree with them. And I think that there is, sometimes in our discussions you can see that happening. There's a kind of a feeling, if you don't agree with me, you're not respecting me, you're not listening to me. That doesn't follow. Democracy works by those disagreements being shared and understood, and some kind of growth can happen out of them. Some kind of wisdom can grow out of them.
I suppose one of the challenges, particularly when we're looking at the traditions that informs moral conscience and our own consciences, and we talk about the role of faith and the Christian and the Catholic tradition, is that some people will turn around and say, well, it's a bit rich for the Church to be preaching about moral conscience and freedom of conscience, considering you only recognised it at the Second Vatican Council in some respects as an institution. And of course, in many respects that's not a fair assessment, but that can be one of the attacks that's made and when you're participating in a debate on something like this.
Yeah, well, I mean, in theory, anyway, I think the Church always recognised the dignity of conscience. Thomas Aquinas says you have to act in accordance with your conscience. Cardinal Ratzinger, before we was Pope, wrote a very interesting article about that we must obey our conscience. But also saying, how, as we were saying at the beginning, that's a very complicated process to arrive at a really honest, objective judgment.
Okay. I think, if it's okay, John, time-wise, we might move to the next piece of music. But before we do that, I suppose, Murray, just to, round up the conversation, we've explored what conscience is, what it means to have an informed conscience, how conscience should be constantly, developed and expanded and challenged in ourselves, and how we need to create that space both, individually and as a community, to be able to dialogue with ourselves, within ourselves and between ourselves, so that all kind of views should be taken into account, challenged if needs be, but also ultimately that when we come to make a decision, that we can have the dignity to do that as an individual, and also, that each person can do it and participate in the community and the society that they live in.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. I mean, I think unless we're open to everybody else, we're not going to come to wise decisions. But it's not easy. And I think the more we get into the kind of thing you mentioned earlier about extremes, kind of yelling at one another, the less that happens. And you develop into a thing where almost it's about winning an argument rather than about seeking the truth.
Exactly.
They're two very different things. You find it not just in the political area, you find it even in kind of discussions in communities and so on. Now, somebody goes into the annual general meeting and all they want to do is get their particular way through, not to listen to what anyone else has to say.
Okay. All right, John. I think if we kind of leave the topic there, I think Bishop Donal has given us a lot of food for thought this morning.
Perfect.
As a community, we face many decisions all the time, but particularly around this time. And just with that, I suppose maybe we just let people to pause and just to reflect and to think about what was said. And we have our next piece of music.
A next piece of music, and it just so happens, as usual, the Holy Spirit's in complete control of this program, because the piece of music they've got lined up after speaking about conscience and so on and so forth is from the Emmanuel community, from the album Rejoice, and this one is The Lord Is My Light. So let's hear this.
stumble and falter, I'll lift my head and sing, you are my strength and power, you will guide me in your way.
Sacred Space on West Limerick 102.